Okay.
And I think we're off.
Okay. My name's John Sise. I worked at Bethlehem Steel from 1973 until 1993, at which point in time I went off on a totally different career. But when I was at Bethlehem Steel, I started working in the 18-inch rolling mill for a few years. Then I went to the Coke Works for about 10 years. I was involved after that in a joint management union training program for a number of years. And finally, I spent the last 5 years of my career there in the forging division as a member of staff at that point in time in the quality department. So that's my career at Bethlehem Steel in a nutshell.
Very diverse.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
Hopefully, we could get back into that later on. But a little introduction to the interviewers. I am Joseph Duarte. I live in Jersey, so I am a trespasser here. And I am here for a historical studies major for education, so I want to teach middle school history. And
I'm Giara.
Yes.
I live around here. Well, not around here. I live like 20 minutes away-ish. Like, you know where Shrinkwaller's driving is? You know, over there. I'm also doing history, but for conservation and stuff. Do you want to go like read one of these like off? And then, oh, that's not what I wanted to do. Do you want to like literally just read off these like one by one, except for the ones that he already answered?
Yeah.
Okay.
So, where are you from?
All right, I'm originally from Lancaster County. I grew up in a small community in the middle of Amish and Mennonite country. And in 1968, I came up here to Bethlehem to go to Lehigh University. And I got my degree in a Bachelor of Arts in Government in 1972. And I kicked around a little bit and heard Bethlehem Steel was hiring and they were paying good money. And I went over and got a job at Bethlehem Steel. And I haven't left the valley since. So I've been here since 1968.
What made you come all the way here from Lancaster?
Well, it's actually not that far, but Lehigh was a good engineering school. I started out in engineering and calculus did me in. So then I went into liberal arts. In a nutshell, that's what it was. I could go on forever about, like I said, I grew up in a small community and I came up to Lehigh and there were people here that were educated in private boys' schools and were so far ahead of me academically, it was kind of a shock. So it was very difficult to compete at that level, even though I had a C average, but it was a struggle. It was a real struggle. So I said, there's got to be a better way. So I chose liberal arts, hoping to get into law school, but I did not get into law school. I became a steel worker.
So was it kind of more like you didn't want to go into steel at first, and more like a second backup kind of thing? Did you end up enjoying it, or?
Well, at the time I was looking for a job that paid good money.
Mm-hmm.
All right, bottom line, I don't know what your financial situation was, but I certainly had school loans, but not to the degree that you did. I hate to tell you this, but my school loans for 4 years at Lehigh were $7,000. Different time back then. I had them paid off in 7 years, so I needed a place, and there was always the opportunity to advance at Bethlehem Steel. It was a growing concern. They hired a lot of people in 1973. So I said, why not? I need the bucks. And it just went from there. I mean, steady paycheck till I got my mental act together where I wanted to go. I got so entrenched in the milieu, if you know what I mean, working in heavy industry. And I will say this, having an education at Lehigh is one thing. When I got to the steel plant, it was a totally different education. totally different education. Here's how the real world works. And it was quite a shock.
Did you feel like you wasted your time with school then?
No, no, no. I think it helped me later on in many ways. Because once I got down to the Coke plant, well, I got into maintenance then, which took my wages up again more. I became a shop steward, and that was sort of a bargain basement lawyer at that point in time. You know what I mean? Because I had to interface with management over personnel issues and things like that.
And with the shop steward,
Yes,
is that working with the union?
yes, that was an unpaid union position. So when you look at any union, you have the national or international leadership, whatever the case may be. As far as the steelworkers were concerned, obviously we were based out of Pittsburgh. Then you had district offices, and we were in, well, I forget what district we were in, but those guys were paid by the international union. But then at Bethlehem Steel, we had three locals, 20, 2598, 2599, 2600. I was in 2600. And all three of them had officers. Now, the grievance committee men and the president were paid by my dues, our dues. They were paid out of the local. And the grievance committee obviously dealt with grievances that happened on a daily basis throughout the plant. So they were responsible for different groups, if you will. Me as the shop steward, I only represented people down at the Coke plant in the labor gang and in the maintenance group. There were actually 3 shop stewards in the maintenance group, and I took the labor gang on because they didn't have enough people to have their own shop stewards. So I worked a regular job, and then when time came, yeah, all right, we have some grievances, or I get a phone call, we have a problem here. Or how do you want us to handle this? You come over here, and when I sat down to have grievance meetings, I got paid by the union for those hours. But other than that, I got paid by the company.
How did you get into union work?
Well, immediately upon being hired, you go through a probationary period, maybe 30 days, something like that, and then you've got to join the union because it's a closed shop, or was a closed shop. So then I started going to union meetings to see, trust me, when you step back from a historical perspective and from reality, when you look at this from a reality standpoint, there was a thing years ago, probably the teens, where they did a study of deaths that occurred in steel plants out in Allegheny County. And it was horrendous. I mean, these are just the people that died from safety violations or accidents in the plant, not the ones that were hurt and died later. So, the whole union movement was toward safety, representation, fair wages, safe practices, humane practices, blah, 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 blah. That was sort of right down my alley anyway. And the more I got involved, somebody said to me, we have a shop steward position coming up. Would you be interested in it? And I said yes. And I got elected by the people in my shop. And it went on from there. So, those are the types of things that I would be handling. Somebody's goofing off at work, or somebody makes a claim against management for working when they're not supposed to, or unfair this or unfair that. But we had a labor contract, and I was trained in the contract and other things, training that I went to, and we learned how to deal with these things. So it's, it was just down my alley, so to speak, and it was something to exercise my brain also, besides changing light bulbs and things like that. Well, it was more than changing light bulbs.
You found like gratification.
Yeah. It wasn't without its bumps, should I say. As I was thinking about this conversation, there were interesting expectations on both sides. Let's put it this way. Some people thought that my job as a shop steward was to lie for them when they got in trouble. No, that's not my job. My job is to help you get your butt out of these situations, not to lie for you so you don't get penalized at all, especially if you really screw up. Because I've got other people to concern about that may need help. You just screwed up big time. How can we minimize what's happening to you? Don't ask me to go in there and lie to management about that, because I would have no credibility with them at that point in time. That's just common sense. So you had those types of situations that I had to deal with from time to time. And I think overall, my personal opinion, what happened overall between union and management, it became more of antagonistic game. Who can screw the other guy the most? And that was really, to me, why are we doing this? We're not helping anybody but it worked on both sides. There were supervisors that they delighted in aggravating the union, and they were encouraged in some ways, and I didn't see the point in that. We were there to do a job. Let's get the job done as efficiently and safely as possible, and let's cut out all this other crap. But no, you get a bunch of grown men in a room, you know what's going to happen.
So would you say there was like some kind of weird hierarchy? Like you guys would end up fighting, rubbing elbows and stuff? Or?
No, it'd never be anything physical, but some guys would, well, I always say there was guys on the union side that I was always interacting with them, and I would say to them, if you spend as much time doing your job as trying to get out of it, you would have been done a long time, much effort, should I say. You would have been done a long time ago, but yet you were still trying, how do I get out of this? Just do your job. Then on the other side, you had supervisors that were just, excuse my French, hard asses. They wanted, well, it was beyond by the book. It was, I'm going to be a prick about everything. I'll give you an example. It's one supervisor in the maintenance group. He was on the millwright side. You had a division, millwrights for the mechanics. I was a motor inspector. We were the electricians. You had the riggers that built stuff, and the high tension electric guys, and the bricklayers, and all these different skill sets that were out there. But he was in charge of the millwrights. And one guy came to work like 5 minutes late. Now here's a guy probably in his 50s at the time, model employee, never got in trouble. And you know why he was 5 minutes late? There was a car crash in front of him. He got stuck in traffic. And this guy wanted to write him up. I said, why are you writing this guy up? What are you going to prove by writing this guy up? I talked him out of it. I mean, it's that kind of stuff where people just go to extremes when it's really, you don't need to do that. So it's always playing that game, trying to navigate through these different scenarios that come up in life. And it's kind of tough, and that's why I think some guys, it's just easier to be a hard ass than to try and make rational decisions. So let's put it this way: it never came to blows on the grounds of the company, but I don't know what happened offsite. I could care about that. That's your business. But there were people that definitely hated each other, But keep in mind another thing that I tell people: when I went into the rolling mills in 1973, I was dealing with World War II veterans, Korean veterans, and the guys that were just coming back from Vietnam.
Uh-oh.
So you had that dynamic as well. I worked in the hotbed for a while, and then I worked up in the mill for a while. And the hotbed is where the hot shapes come down, angle or beam, and they come down to what we call the hotbed. That's to help them cool down before they go into the straightener, which takes the mill stress out of it, makes them nice and straight, and they get shipped off at that point in time. And there was one, two, three, four, five, six of us worked on that crew. And every day this one guy would come in and go up into the pulpit where the guy that was operating the hotbed that would push the beams over, and he'd go up there and sleep for a while. Now I'm the new kid in town. Finally, I said to one of the guys, what's the story with that he comes in here and sleeps for an hour? Don't you say a word about him. I said, why not? He was in the Battle of the Bulge. He's never gotten over that. You know, that's 30 years after that experience, PTSD, you know, and then you had the guys coming back from Vietnam. Some of the guys that came back from Vietnam were messed up for a long time. You know, so now throw that dynamic into everything. And then go down to the Coke plant where you have a huge Hispanic population working in the Coke plant with us white guys. Now you have that to throw into the mix and to get over. And I think that pretty much overall was okay, because one thing you learn working in heavy industry, and I have to say that one of the other things that struck me when I walked into the steel was just the scale of everything. Everything is huge. You know, they give you a hard hat. Hard hat is meaningless. You know, a steel beam hits you on the head, you know, that hard hat is not going to do anything. But anyway, one thing you learn there is you got to trust each other, because it just like that, you could be mincemeat. So when you're working with Puerto Ricans or Mexicans and they're working with you, you got to depend on them. And after a while, it's like, hey, he's my bud. You know, it's like, it's no big deal. He's just another guy. You know, he's nothing special, nothing to discriminate between him and I. We're both out here trying to do a job. So you had to learn to live together. And I think that was a big positive in those areas, but that wasn't 100%, but generally speaking, you know, it worked out pretty well because it was such a serious thing. But anyway, I digress.
Was there like the incident for you, like some really big bad thing that you always remember that everyone was like, oh my God, I can't believe that happened?
Well, a couple things. I mean, one thing is when you're working in a facility that works 24/7, you're there at all times, day or night. You know, I worked shift work for a while, which is an interesting experience. You know, where over a 3-week period or 4-week period, you worked so many days and you had a couple days off. You worked so many middle shifts and then you had a couple days off, although you had to come in for a night shift, which really chopped off one day, but then you had a long weekend. So you saw the plant at all times of the day and night. Where was I going with this? I don't know. But the other thing that sticks in my mind is when guys get killed. And I know of 2 cases, one more personal than the other, where I actually visited the guy in the hospital and I thought he was going to make it. And the next day, he was gone. I mean, it was really weird. He worked down at the EFM, the electric furnace. Imagine a big container, electric furnace, that's what it is. You have this big carbon probe that draws an arc, and that's what melts the steel. So down there, you're making special types of steel for nuclear application, for power generation application. It's not like regular steel that they use for making beams and stuff like that. It's different combinations of chrome and moly and things like that. And there's a certain order that you dump these different ores in as you mix. There's actually a convection cycle that the arc develops where the steel just circulates inside the furnace. And somebody lined them up wrong. And when he put this one charge of one of the ores in, the furnace blew back. The flames came out. Now he's sitting in a charging car And if you want to see a charging car, there's one over at the National Museum of Industrial History. I'm surprised they have it there. It's sitting outside. But he was protected this way. The flame ran around him, but behind him was a solid piece of metal. It hit that and came back and burned him from behind. Yeah, it's just bizarre. They solved that problem, but it didn't work for him. There was another situation where, relating back to what I said before, there was a shop steward in not the electrical gang, but maybe not a rigger, maybe a high tension guy. I don't know what it was. One of your key pieces of safety equipment is a lock. So when you go on a piece of equipment, you pull the main power switch and you lock it out so it can't be energized. So here comes a shop steward from another group, comes in there and gets this guy's lock off without his knowledge and starts working on the piece of doing something. And they come over and say, what the heck's going on here? You took my lock off this. Well, there was a big hubbub about this. And when his bosses found out about it, they were going to write him up, discipline him. He comes to me and says, they came to me first and said, what should we do? I said, you write the guy up. You don't break those safety rules for anybody. You could have killed somebody. People have been killed that way, where pieces of equipment have moved and run over people. I saw one guy get knocked down. Fortunately, he survived. He just took a glancing blow, but 50 tons of steel moving at 5 miles an hour you're still going to lose the battle, And he came over to me. He says, how could you tell them to write you up? You took the guy's safety lock. I don't care that you're a shop steward. I mean, that always stuck in my craw, because you're supposed to protect your guys. You're not supposed to do stupid stuff like that.
And this was when you were a shop steward?
Yeah, when I was a shop steward with the electricians. Another thing that stuck in my craw too a little bit, we had a supervisor, Joe Cray. Old guy, little skinny guy. After a while, he took the position because we had a young group working in his shop. He would basically say, I need A, B, C, and D done. Go do it. Well, that's the way it's supposed to be. You tell us what to do, we go do it. They forced him into retirement because he didn't have people filing enough grievances against him. Now explain that to me. Why does that mean anything? You would want to have as few grievances as possible. It's like, well, and that's what gets back to my theory that both sides started to look at how can I screw the other guy the most. Now, there was a lot of good things that went on there. I mean, don't get me wrong. A lot of things got done there over the years, believe it or not, that were good. And there was a lot of good workers, a lot of good supervisors, but there's always these outliers that mess everything up for everybody else.
The bad apples.
Yeah, and bad apples can spoil a barrel. I mean, it's not just one or two, and maybe you're lucky you get one or two, you get rid of them, but it sets a mindset. If this is, well, you can see what's happening in the country today. If you set a mindset, this is what we want you to believe, well, people start going down that road, whether it's the right thing or not.
Did you ever consider leaving?
Oh, yeah. I did several times. I was looking from time to time. And then this opportunity came for me to switch over to the forging division, where I spent my last 5 years. And I got into staff there. And what they needed was someone who was going to do statistical process control on rolls that we supplied to our sister plants and other plants that rolled sheet steel for the automotive industry. Okay, so I don't know if you know how the automotive industry works. I didn't know this either, but I don't think it's changed much now, but you have to be on an approved vendors list And let's just take a regular car. You have front, rear fenders, quarter panels, left side, right side, trunk, hood, roof. You get qualified not for the whole car, but by piece. All right. So, you get approved for the bed floor of a pickup truck or the hood for a Chevy Cavalier or something like that. And they have criteria that you must meet. And they test they do inspection of your material from time to time. But I know you might not be aware of this, but it was that time that this little document called ISO 9000 came out. Now, if you know about ISO 9000, I would be very surprised. But it was a turnaround in how industry approached quality management. Now, I'm giving you some history here. We're diverting a little bit. Only because I came into contact with this. During World War II, the military said, now you're going to start proving to us that what you're giving us is what you say it is. For instance, I did meet some guys that they worked for a munitions factory and they had to do sampling and shoot the rocket or shoot the missile or whatever, and it better work. That was a release criteria to the military. So they developed this thing called military specs or mil specs. Basically, train your people, calibrate your instruments, do inspections, blah, 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 stuff like that. Well, that started to become adopted or morphed into these more general quality assurance management standards that then became impacted on North American providers because they were making product for the European market. And ISO 9000 has taken off since then. I was qualified to audit 9001, 13485, all sorts of other stuff in my later career. But that was the beginning of it. So we had to do statistical process control analysis on these rolls. And what a roll does is basically, and it's a mill, and the metal comes in there and it shapes the metal. So how consistent is it in thickness and length? What are types of surface defects do you have, and all this other stuff? So it was the beginning of that type of movement. And that's how I got drawn into Bethforge. Now, I also got into quality auditing then, which was my leap out of Bethlehem Steel into medical devices of all things. And also, I was the acting chief inspector at Bethforge for a while. And what that meant is I had a couple of inspectors and observers that reported to me. And they would inspect certain materials. I had to sign off on their reports, and they would observe. Now, you're saying, what's an observer? Let's go back to the EFM. It basically was this in some instances. They would go in and take a temperature, and the melter would say it's 2,000 degrees, and the observer would look at the thermometer or whatever. Yep, it's 2,000 degrees, and he'd write it down. So it's a double check. And that was what they would do. They would double check. He would have to make some calculations. They were making calculations. So it was a double check on what was going on. So you're just not relying on one data stream. So I had those guys. I had guys down at the press forge that inspected certain materials for dimensions and stuff like that. I have a good story about that. Just telling somebody about it the other day. Think about the cost of making a roll. And a roll looks like a Tootsie Roll Pop, with ends on it, because you got to grab it as it turns around. Well, by the time you melt it, press it, heat treat it, machine it, you have all your money in it. Now, they always leave a little extra on the ends, so when it's in the machine, they can grab that end while the machine is turning. All right, when the roll is done, that gets burned off. So one of the supervisors said, I put a mark on that roll out there. Go burn it off at that mark. The mark was in the wrong position. And when he burned it off, the roll was not usable. That was $125,000 at that time. Just send it back. We'll use the steel. And I said, did you give him the blueprint to go out there and make sure the measurement was right? No. Hmm. Why should I? Well, that's why you should. And when I got into medical devices, it became more apparent why you would do that stuff. But it was a transition period, um, among other things, as we were facing a new age of manufacture and looking at manufacturing. And I've seen this in other industries. Well, this is the way we've always done it, versus how do you stay ahead of the curve and that kind of thing.
The connection. So you said you went from Bethlehem Steel to a medical. Can you tell me a little bit about the transition?
I always say I went from hard hat to hairnet. I went from being one of the youngest people to being one of the oldest people. I went to work for B. Braun, and B. Braun makes, among other things, disposable medical devices, class 2 medical devices, and they have clean rooms. So you have to wear a hairnet and booties and a suit and all that stuff because you're trying to keep. I had to learn the good manufacturing practices, the GMPs. But because of my background in ISO 9001 and the mil specs and the nuke specs that we had to work to, because we were making forgings for the Navy nuclear program, so we had to deal with those requirements. It wasn't as much of a jump, and I understood process. And when you go to medical device manufacture, it's basically the same type of process. You're just making different products. It's sort of the same types of rules, but a little bit more elaborate. So you just have to learn to say, okay, this is what it says on a piece of paper. What does that mean in real life? And making steel is the same way, or doing your job is the same way. This is what it says theoretically. What happens out there in the real world? What are the things like corrosion, dust, all this other stuff? How does that impact what's going on while you're making steel and stuff like that? So it wasn't as much of a jump knowledge-wise as it was culturally. That was a big jump. Because I couldn't talk as dirty. Because most of the employees there were women. So but, that's another story.
So what do you think now if you ever go back down there and look at everything just sitting there abandoned?
Well, I've done that. Actually, I've been back to Lehigh Heavy Forge. I've done a tour of Lehigh Heavy Forge. In fact, the guy that's running it, he was there when I was there. So I walked in. I mean, one of the other things is not only the scale, but it's the sounds and the smells when you walk into these places, burning oil, steel, bubbling, you hear these different noises and you have these different smells. And it was like, geez, I'm being transported back in time. Now, how do I feel when I look at that? I say, boy, what a waste. Well, let me tell you another story about that. And the collapse of steel is far more complex than some people might want you to believe. I remember sitting in a meeting when I was at Beth Forge with, he was the head of the labs at the time, another Lehigh grad, and we were chatting. He says, I just came out of a meeting with the VP and we were going over the financials. And he's going over the financials in his head while the VP is talking. And he raises his hand. He says, okay, let me get this straight. If we all worked here at Beth Forge for free, no labor charge, no benefits, we'd still be losing money. Is that correct? And that was correct. That didn't account for raw materials or process costs. How do you survive in that situation? The furnaces that we were using at that time were already over 40 years old, a couple of generations behind, inefficient and that kind of stuff. So, I think Bethlehem Steel was a little bit behind the times, a little bit in getting things done. It was changing a culture though. And I think as I went on to different jobs, I can see how difficult it becomes because every company has its own culture. Some groups have their own culture within a company, and sometimes it's very difficult to change that easily. That's why when companies come in and buy out another company, a lot of times there's a lot of people out the door because they got to come in and change the culture or the way things are done according to the guy who just bought there, the people that just bought your company. That's not unusual. So, it was a strength and a weakness. I mean, in the mill that I was at, there was 2 or 3 generations of guys there. Down at the Coke Works, there was 2, 3 generations of guys there. There were brothers that worked there. Same down at the mill. That was not uncommon. For shops to be known for, oh, that's where all the Hungarians work. Oh, that's where the Puerto Ricans work. That was not unusual. So it's tough to change a culture, and that contributed to the demise. Plus the change of the world economy that was going on in the 70s and 80s. I think we were just not positioned to handle that well.
How do you think like Bethlehem culture has changed since it shut down?
Well, Bethlehem has been fortunate in a way. Because of the steel strike in 1959, there was a big steel strike in 1959. Some people here, and I didn't know it, I wasn't even here in 1959, but later on I learned this because I live right next to a business park, but they started to develop these business parks, and they're all over Bethlehem and the surrounding area. In fact, if you go down to where I used to work at the Coke plant, that's all intermodal now. There's business parks in there where you have different companies working in there. They're all over the place. And they said, we've got to protect ourselves against being too reliant on Bethlehem steel. And there was a little bit of a transition period, I think. I first noticed it. It was in the habit of cutting myself or something like that when I was working. So I had to go to the dispensary all the time. Yeah, he's bleeding again, And they used to have a dispensary down at the Coke Works. Well, to cut costs, they got rid of the dispensary at the Coke Works. So I had to take what we would call a pie wagon up to the main dispensary that's was over on the south side, down near New Street. Pie wagon was just a van, big van, take people around. I remember coming from the Coke Works up into the main part of the plant, and I'm looking around and I'm saying, where is everybody? That was 81, 82, when they just started throwing people out the door, because they were cutting back so much. So you saw some of these ripples start to happen in the 80s. And of course, with the demise in 2002, 2003. But there was this thing called Music Fest that came along in 1984. And that sort of created a place to come to. There's been a renaissance in a way there. But these business parks did take up some of the slack, although not at the wages and benefits that they were enjoying at Bethlehem Steel. But people weren't going out of work they weren't being out of work for very long. I mean, some guys did stick with steel and they went to work up in Lackawanna or out in Steelton, as long as those places were open. I think a couple guys went out to Burns Harbor. But I think Bethlehem is fortunate in that respect. So the culture here has changed, certainly from heavy industry until more of who's the biggest employer in the Lehigh Valley right now? It's the hospitals. That's because all us guys are aging out. It's ridiculous. Well, plus the warehouses.
Oh.
Yeah. Don't talk to me about warehouses. Well, just given where we are physically located, we're within 11 hours driving time of maybe 50, 45, 50% of the population of the United States. It's a perfect place to put down warehouses. Boston, New York, Wilmington. There's a big port in Connecticut, Virginia. You get that stuff in there. It's just
even just going north.
Yeah. So I think Bethlehem's been fortunate. Are we ever going to see heavy industry come back here? I think the answer to that is no. I think people are deluding themselves if they think heavy industry is going to come back. Certainly not here. But, you know, we still have the cement industry here. That's not as big as it used to be. Um, you know, what used to be one of the biggest employers in Lehigh Valley was the textile industry, the needles trade. And that went out in the 70s and 80s too. And that employed a lot of women, and that was gone. So they had to overcome that as well. Because I remember being a student at Lehigh, and down there on 3rd Street was a big garment factory. They were all over the place, you know. So it's like everybody else had to adjust to some of these traditional industries just leaving. And the other thing that changed about the steel industry, by the way, is going from a converter, which Bethlehem Steel was, a converter, which means I take the ore, I make steel, I roll it, I cut it, I ship it, to what are called mini mills. What a mini mill does is they take scrap, they melt it in an EFM and go right into rolling it, cut it, and shipping. They do away with this whole front end of making steel. So of course their overhead cost is a lot cheaper. You know, so that's another thing, more than the Japanese, but everybody has. The other thing that I tell people all the time is, where were we in 1945? Where was the world in 1945? Europe was destroyed. Japan was destroyed. Russia was destroyed. China was destroyed. Guess who wasn't destroyed? We weren't. We rebuilt the world between 1945 and say 1970. And after that, the world was catching up, and we did not respond to that. There was 25 years there where we were gangbusters. There were 5 guys at Bethlehem Steel in the 50s that were making $1 million a year. Now think about that.
What would you say is your best and worst memory working there?
I think the best memories were the friendships made, people that I still know and see from time to time. I think the best memory is what I learned there overall. The worst memory is, you know, having to deal with when somebody, well, the one guy that was killed up in the coal fields, that was disgusting.
In the coal field?
Yeah. So when you make coke, you have to burn coal. And Bethlehem Steel had its own mines, well, for a while. And coke is made from coal. So they would bring shipload after, well, some of the best memories too were when we had our little illegal Christmas parties. All right. I could get into the difference between what the people in the offices and what we did, but that's another story. We would sneak stuff in, you know, a little bit of wine, a little bit of beer, and then food, and we'd have a Christmas party in the shop. And by and large, the supervisors knew to get lost, or they came in and drank with us. You know, it just depends. You know, those were the good times when you had a little bit of camaraderie and you did things together, and there was no pressure. You know, everybody was there, and you had a good time being together, working together. Those are good memories.
Or a lot of something I kind of, at least in the beginning of our conversation, was at least about Bethlehem Steel itself and the culture, the difference between unions and then the higher ups. Was, besides the Christmas parties, was there any other times in which you felt together?
No. Very, very few times.
So it's very us and them.
Well, that's what I mean. I think let's not deal with supervision above a certain level. All right. When you get down into shop level, maybe site level, it depends on the people there. You might, down at the coke plant, there's 1 or 2 supervisors that nobody would have felt bad about if they disappeared in a coke oven one day, but that's another story. But by and large, we got along pretty well. So the culture there, except for the couple weirdos on both sides, was pretty amicable. All right. It's not a great place to work. You got to make the best of it. You know, you don't want to have the stress of having to deal with some jerk over there. There was a few, but not a lot. You could go to other places where that's not the same. But I would say generally at a certain level and below. Oh, for instance, when I worked shift work, after middle shift, we would always go down to the Hellertown Hotel a couple times a month and have pizza and beer afterwards. Line supervisors came with us. That did happen. But there wasn't anything formal where we had to be together. And certainly when you throw in the corporate guys, that's a whole lot, you know, you plant, blah, blah, blah. Even the super, blah, 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 you're plant people. You know, so you did have this hierarchical thing. Well, you know, I just saw a picture of this guy not too long ago, and I forget where it was. Johnny Cuck. Hadn't remembered his name, and I saw a picture of him. Him and his buddy shift worked 30 years together, something like that. And I remember him telling me a story. He said he used to go to St. Anne's Catholic Church over on Easton Avenue or Eaton Avenue over that way before they split it because it was getting too big. Now, I don't know if you're familiar with the demographics here in Bethlehem. The baby boom sort of here really made itself felt in the late 60s when they split off Freedom and Liberty. It used to be one high school, then it went to two high schools. Well, the same way with that church. And he said, you know, I went to this church and there were supervisors there that I knew would not even talk to me at church. And then when they said, now we got to form another Catholic church, those were the guys that were saying, you know, you people over there, you go to that church. So yeah, there was a culture here that, and I think they came to realize that a little bit too late, because that training program that I was involved in was Partners in Progress. And what we were trying to do was establish some sort of camaraderie between bargaining people and management to work together to solve problems in the workplace. You know, what can we do better out there? So, and it was just too late. It was too late. The culture was so ingrained at that point in time. There were younger people that were willing to try, but to get the old guys, that was very difficult. They just didn't, no, you've treated me like shit for 40 years. That's how you're going to get treated. You know?
Do you believe that's also one of the parts to make Bethlehem Steel?
You cannot survive as an organization if you're fighting among yourselves all the time. You know, that's just the bottom line. You know, you might have enlightened leadership, but if the people carrying it out aren't enlightened and they're not doing the right things, it's tough to do. I mean, I've worked for Roche Vitamins, so B. Braun, Roche Vitamins, J&J, Church and Dwight. Now, there's another job. I worked for the company that made Trojan condoms, but we won't go into that. If you want to hear some good stories, I have some good stories.
I want to hear some good stories.
And then Agilent Technologies. And I could tell you, the bigger the company, sometimes the harder it is to have a company-wide culture, but not impossible. And I think Agilent and Church and Dwight especially, I think, even despite one or two little flaws, they knew how to manage. When I wrote an audit report, and I was a quality assurance auditor. I got a master's degree from the School of Pharmacy at Temple in quality assurance and regulatory affairs in 2000. When I would write an audit report, the vice presidents would read my audit reports and ask me about them. That says to me, they're concerned. That never happened at Bethlehem Steel. Never happened at Bethlehem Steel. I mean, and that was a problem. There were people that were trying to change that, but I think, you know, and then Roche was another place like, oh God, just that hierarchy, I'm better than you type of thing. And they've had their troubles. Well, they got sold. Agilent, Agilent, because it was so big, though, it allowed different groups to manage their own cultures better. And I was in a good culture there. So it is achievable if you treat your employees with respect, and say, yes, you are worth something. If you're unwilling to do that, you're going to get exactly. Oh, this is one thing I was looking up in preparation for this. Frederick Taylor. Ever hear of Frederick Taylor? Frederick Taylor. It's Taylor Jim over there and stuff like that. Frederick Taylor was the developer of scientific management. What is scientific management? And he did some of his studies here at the Bethlehem plant, the phlegmatic Dutchman, as he called him. Here's a process. Well, we're going to break it down into individual steps because none of these guys are smart enough to do more than one thing. All right, so you're telling me all I'm capable of doing. Now, I've seen this done elsewhere. Trust me, it's nothing new. Some of my trips to China were very eye-opening, and that's basically what they did is they lined people up and just pass things down the line. That's scientific management. It's like you're only capable of doing one task. That's all you're capable of doing. Instead of, like some places, since I'm a little bit of a car nut, guy will build a whole motor by himself. A bunch of guys will build a whole car by themselves. Doing multiple tasks to achieve a final goal goes against scientific management. But scientific management was the basis of American industry well into the 20th century, even into our time. So I think as a maintenance guy, we got a little bit more respect because we had to do more things. But the average guy that just, imagine this is your job. Well, I could tell you the same thing with condoms. Imagine this is your job. And let's get back to the coal field. Cars of coal would come in, chunks of coal, go through the coal crusher machine, building. Just a bunch of metal hammers beating up this coal into basically very fine particles. Then that would be belted out to different areas in the coal field. So we'd have coal from this mine here, coal from that mine there, blah, blah, blah. And they test the coal as it comes in for BTUs, basic thermal units. So they had to mix the right amount of stuff to charge the ovens. So when they mixed it, we had these land movers, the big land movers, the guys that come along and scrape dirt up and it goes into, well, they would go out there and fill their tractor, not the tractor, but the container, whatever it is, with coal, and then go to a place where they'd open it up and it'd dump down on a conveyor belt and go to the coal tanks that then charged the Larry cars. Don't ask me why they're called Larry cars, which then charged I called them Lawrence mobiles, but then they go charge it into the individual ovens. Well, I remember that spring, it was very dry. And for like 2 or 3 days, it rained very heavy. So you had dry coal, wet coal. This guy comes up with a Caterpillar, parks it here. If he would have got out the other side of his piece of equipment, he would have been all right, but he got out the side facing the coal pile collapsed on him. He was suffocated, crushed to death. I mean, that shuts down. I mean, everybody, when we heard that, it was like, because the guy had no chance. When dumb stuff like that happens, it's just out of the, freak of nature type stuff. But that was one of the bad days when stuff like that happens, because there's nothing you can do about it. And I remember the day the 5 guys got killed up in the soaking pit. They were rebuilding a soaking pit and a wall fell on them. I mean, So what a soaking pit is, when the ingots are made, they're not used right away. So you put them in a pit that's gas fired to keep them hot, and it's all refractory. So the refractory wears out after a while. So you go in there and tear it down, and you rebuild it. Bricklayers do that. Well, the wall fell in. 5 guys, 4 or 5 guys at one time. But anyway, imagine this is the only job you have. This is scientific management. I'm now the Larry car operator. I come over, and I have a guy down here that just takes a hook and pulls off the cap of all the charging ports into the oven. I charge the coal. I back off. He puts the lids back on and puts a little mud around it. That's his job all day long. That's all he does. That's scientific management. It's just meaningless work all day long. Now, how do you get through a day doing meaningless work like that?
Sucks.
Yes, exactly.
What did he do when he went on break?
Well, we had 3 breaks a day, 15 in the morning, 15 in the afternoon, and half an hour for lunch. So basically, you went in, had a snack, maybe read the newspaper, closed your eyes for a few minutes, and you didn't go to the bathroom. You didn't have much time for anything else.
So you just shove food in your face and leave?
Yes.
So what did you do when you finally got home? Like, how would you unwind?
Drugs and alcohol.
What kind of drugs?
Oh, did you want to know?
Yeah.
Yeah, Pete down the street. Well, at the time, marijuana was big, but I gave that up a long time ago. No, I became a runner. I started running, and I got involved with a lot of civic activities. I've been singing in a choral group for 40 some years.
So that's what you would do when you would get home from work?
Yeah, well, you'd have to take another shower because you still smelled like rotten eggs from working the coke plant. But I'd come home, go for a run, take a shower. If I was married at the time, then I'd have to do stuff with my wife. But I did. I was in different, volunteered at Muhlenberg Medical Center. I was in the JCs, sang in a choir. I kept myself busy.
Sometimes it's hard to keep yourself busy after coming home from a long day of work.
I was young back then. There is a difference. Trust me. I had, once I started running, I got more energetic, went to the gym. I was not a big bar person. I did not care to go out. I had got that out of my system at Lehigh. I was in a fraternity. I've had enough beer.
So would most other steelworkers do this thing, or would they also just do drugs and alcohol?
There was certainly. I was oversimplifying. Now, of course, there were many guys there that didn't know what drugs were. But in my age group, that was not uncommon. But you'd be surprised at the number of guys that had businesses on the side. They would. A couple guys were landlords. They would buy homes, fix them up, rent them out. Pete Ramos had his own realty company. I forget what his first name was, Dugan. He put my first heat pump in at home, and he still has the business 40 years later. So there was a lot of guys that did things. Some guys were farmers. But there were guys that just go home. They had a family. They did the family thing, I don't know that my life was typical of all those guys, but there were certainly people with alcohol issues, and there were some people with drug issues. I mean, that was a fact of life, still a fact of life. I mean, it's just the way it is. I mean, maybe not as bad as it used to be, but I don't know. In an average workplace, certainly once you got into Bethlehem Steel, you were making above average wages, so you tried not to you lose that privilege. But as I said, a lot of these guys were coming back from Vietnam, and some of these guys were like really messed up.
How would they act?
Well, they were the ones that tended to be a little bit more aggressive, bad attitudes. They were suffering from PTSD, might have had a drug issue or a drinking issue. Most of them got over it, but not all of them. We had programs through the company and through the bargaining unit to deal with that. Some of the guys I knew took advantage of that because they knew they had a problem. One thing I would say that on the local or on the bottom level, the managers there knew what was going on, I think. And if they were a good worker overall, they tried to do the best by that person. There were some guys that were just losers. I mean, you do make mistakes. I don't know of too many people being fired. I know of some people being fired.
How'd they get fired?
Oh, doing something really ridiculous, like get caught stealing a lot. Before I went to the Coke plant, there were guys that had this thing going on in the plant where they had a rail car parked, a dumper, a coal car. And we would dump our scrap metal in there, copper, stuff like that, that we could resell or reuse. And they came up with this idea that they were going to have one, and then one of the guys on PB&NE is going to move this car off site somewhere, and they're going to go take all this material and get a lot of money. Well, they got caught. They all got fired. That kind of thing. I would say back then that the causes, well, it wasn't until the end of my time in the bargaining unit that women came back into the workplace. So we didn't have a lot of issues with that while I was there. Although we did have one issue. Another one, I thought this was, one of the operations supervisors came to me one day and says, "Oh, we have a problem here. We want your opinion." And I said, "What is it?" "Well, we caught a couple doing it somewhere." And I said, "Were they on break?" "Yes." "Was it consensual?" "Yes." "What's the problem?" And that was the end of it. But we didn't have a lot of at least there we didn't have a lot of the stuff going on, because once again, you didn't, in that environment, you generally didn't work in big groups. You were at your station or you worked with a buddy. It wasn't like 5 or 6 of us working together all the time. But silly stuff like that happened all the time. There were some guys that got fired for not showing up. A couple guys. So, warning: 1 day off, 3 days off, 5 days off, 10 days off, you're out the door. If you screwed up that many times in a period of time, well, then maybe you should be out the door. But, I was half kidding with drugs and alcohol, but it certainly was an issue. And even some of the old timers still had drinking issues. So you knew who they were. So when you worked with them, you were, especially down in the mill. Oh, he's the crayman again today. All right, he's moving stuff around. So you're always got an eye on him. Make sure he's not going to hit you with anything. But yeah, it's a bunch of guys working in heavy industry. It's somewhat of the Wild West out there a little bit. So, it's just, it's, again, one of the big differences when I jumped to medical devices, now I had to deal with a lot of women, and I was not used to dealing with a lot of women in the workplace. So now I had to watch what I say, how I acted, blah, 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 because what I could say to a steel worker would not be acceptable in other situations, so.
What would you say to a steel worker that wouldn't be acceptable in another situation?
Well, I would, cursing, telling them what they could do with things and, stuff like that. Just, well, and
Goes back to the culture, I think.
yes, it's a different culture. A lot of things get, I would just have to watch my language, because I was, there was a lot of French being spoken out there. It's also now, I'm not going to quote unquote sexually harass another guy, not me personally, but now with women, it's a different story. What is sexual harassment? What to me at the time was sexual harassment was probably not how some women, to me it would be more overt. To them, but they probably looked at more subtle aspects of what they would think harassment is. So it's like I had to realize, all right, this is acceptable talk. Now, one of the problems was in this singing group, and it was a mixed group, altos, sopranos, tenors, basses, and the women there, most of them I've known so well, I could say stuff, to them and get away with it because they'd throw it right back at me. I can't do that at the job site because I don't know them that well, uh, so it was just a cultural thing and me learning what not to say and what to say. Trust me, if you worked in a steel plant, after a while you're saying the same things everybody else is, because that's the environment. When I went to work for B. Braun and everybody else, it's like, I have to be nice now. I mean, we called each other names. I mean, it's just the way guys are, at least back then. Anyway.
Is there anything major you think we're missing?
Like, was there any strain that working there put on like personal relationships?
Yes. I think, well, one of the strains my wife would always tell me about was I would stink when I get home. All right. So I worked in the Coke plant. Probably at the mill it wasn't so bad. But the typical setup, certainly after OSHA came in, OSHA, EPA, was approved and the regulations were issued for coke oven emissions and stuff like that. In our new washroom, the old washrooms were a real scream. I mean, a real scream. You just came in there and you had those, I don't know if you've ever seen the buckets that come down off of pulleys and stuff like that with the hooks. Well, down at the mill and before EPA came in, your work clothes were hanging there. So you let it down in the morning and you put your street clothes on the same hooks and you put your work clothes on. And you're going to lock it and go to work, come back, same thing. You go take a shower with 40 or 50 or 60 other naked guys. Not an experience that I would recommend to too many people. But we had these big washrooms. So now when we went to the Coke plant, we had a clean side, dirty side. And the clean side is that you came in and you had a locker, you put your work clothes or your street clothes in there and you put on these wooden flip-flops and you go over to the dirty side. And then on the dirty side is where you had your work clothes because your work clothes then were special clothes and they were cleaned by the company. But still, after working in rotten eggs all day, I would come to the washroom, take a shower as best as I can, go home. Oh, the one time that I would really notice it is when I come back from vacation or when my car, it was raining and I get in my car, I could smell the sulfur dioxide in there. My wife would tell me when I'd come home, it says, oh, you smell. And even if I took another shower, it just gets in your pores. I think the more of the strain occurs when you're working odd shifts or you're working double shifts. If you're working odd shifts, then you basically, especially for guys with families, I never had kids, so I can't relate to this. But if you had to work weekends all the time, or if you were working swing shift, you were working 2 out of every 3 weekends. That's where I think it would disrupt family life because you couldn't, I'm getting home at 7:30 in the morning from 11 to 7 shift. I don't want to hear a lot of noise in the house. I want to go to bed, and that kind of stuff. The shift that I hated the most was 3 to 11. I hated that because you'd get home, you'd be in bed by 2 o'clock, and then you'd get up and, I have 3 or 4 hours to do something maybe, so it does constrict you that way. And so being an hourly guy and then being a salary guy, the difference there is expectations on how much time you put on the job. And then certainly when I went on to other jobs is what do you do in your own time? All right. For instance, I would take work home with me. Well, should you be doing that all the time? Although it may or may not be expected to. That's why I'm glad I never became a lawyer. But, when I did work for Agilent, I was taking phone calls at 1 or 2 o'clock in the morning 5 or 6 in the morning because I had to talk to people all over the world. So it can. I think a lot of guys adjusted to it that worked steady day shift or a steady middle or a steady night, but in the facilities that worked around the clock, yeah.
So your biggest strain with your wife was that you reeked.
Well, with my first wife is another story.
Okay.
I think it was just too unsteady work hours, and she was by herself too much, and blah blah blah, and we just went our different ways. So I can see it affecting relationships that way. But any job can do that. I don't think it's relegated to that. But I would say a 24/7 operation that can provide some challenges, because you're not at home for the kids, you're not at home to do this, and if you're in the bargaining unit, it's certainly not like when I was in salary, where hey, I need to take today off. This just doesn't work. You're hourly, you're scheduled, you be there. We didn't have the luxury then of, if you're sick, I'm going to take a sick day. You don't get sick days unless it's in the contract. We never had sick days. You showed up for work. Oh, do you want to work a double? Good. Now you work a double. There was guys that lived for double shifts, but that's another story. So your flexibility, and we had to bid for vacation weeks. All right. So for example, here's 12 months, and management would decide the maximum number of people that can be off on any week, by group. All right. And so certainly in the summertime, and if you ever heard about 13 weeks vacation, have you ever heard about 13 weeks vacation? We'll get into that then. Say in my group, during the peak vacation hour, June to August, the most of the guys that could be out would be 6 out of 140 guys. Well, guys with the most seniority picked first, then the next guy, and here you are in the bottom of the seniority poll. You're picking November or March or something like that. So if your family wanted to get together down at Ocean City, Maryland for the week of Labor Day, you were SOL. Here's when I can take my vacation. One of the things that the steelworkers tried in the 70s was to give the senior guys 13 weeks vacation. And the reason for that was to hire other people so that they could come in, and then they would bring new bodies into this. Well, that didn't last too long either. But just think about it: 4 weeks vacation every year, or 4 months vacation, 3.5 months vacation every 5 years. It was. I could deal with that. I got 4 weeks once, 5 weeks once. After a while, you don't know what to do with yourself. Especially at that time, I was younger, didn't have the resources that I have now. So what am I going to do? I can't fly around the world, But that was the thought. So there is some inflexibility. When you get into management, then it becomes more flexible.
There is one last thing we do need to cover, which is the consent form.
Oh, I have to consent to this now.
If there's anything that you are a little iffy about of what you said, you could cross it out. Say anything.
No, I'm fine. So if you want to hear some stories about Trojan condoms, I'll tell you. when we turn the mics off.
Just quickly read over this, and then we're gonna.
Yes. You want me to fill this in, or are you going to do? I'll fill it in. Can we turn the mics off now?
Yes.
Then I can tell you about the condoms. Whoops.